Good evening. The day Aaron argued with Moshe, sorry, you were never meant to be perfect. Sorry, you were never meant to be perfect. That's the title of the lesson tonight. So we're all, of course, familiar with the personality and the figure of Moshe. Moshe is the leader of the Jewish people. He's the iconic leader of the Jewish people who takes them out of Egypt. Moshe, of course, possessed a limitless amount of patience and care. And we know this from the famous story of how Moshe was originally a shepherd. Remember the story about how Moshe was a shepherd? Moshe was a shepherd, and he was taking care of the sheep. And one day, one of the sheep runs away, and so he leaves the entire flock to go find that one single sheep. So he cares. He's caring, and he's loving, and he has patience. But in today's lesson, we're going to see a little bit of a different side of Moshe. A little bit of a different side of Moshe's personality and Moshe's steadfast endorsement of truth, as we'll see soon. What's the event? This week's Parshas is Parshas Shemini. What does Shemini mean? Shemini means the 8th day of the period in which they inaugurated the Tabernacle. When the Tabernacle was first built, there was a period where they inaugurated it. It wasn't just, well, let's build it, let me come right in, and it all works beautifully. It needed a process. It needed to be inaugurated. Good evening. And so today's lesson takes place on this 8th day when there's this inauguration of the tabernacle taking place. Aaron, who was Moshe's brother, was of course the high priest. And his two oldest sons were Kohanim as well. They had that status of being Kohanim, priests. They were able to serve in the tabernacle. The younger two did not at that point. They did not. They didn't have that status. It was only the two older ones. He had 4 sons. The 2 of his sons decided on their own to offer up incense that they weren't asked to do. And what happens? There's this fire that emerges from God and consumes them. Whatever that means. Without getting into the details of the story, they pass on, and now, in a state of acute mourning, meaning the first period after there's a passing, one is a state of one assumes a state of an onain. An onain is somebody who's in acute mourning. Acute mourning meaning before the body has been buried, there are various halachic impositions or halachic requirements that this person needs to attend to, and therefore that many of their other obligations are suspended in the face of this status, because they're an onain, so therefore they're no longer obligated in prayer and other things. They're not chayiv and mitzvahs, so long as they are an onain, because they're in that period of acute mourning. They have to make sure that the body is attended to, that it's buried, everything is taken care of, and once they're done with that, now all the other mitzvahs return. So here we have it, that Aaron becomes an onain, and the other 2 sons who now have assumed the status of the Kohanim in place of their brothers, now they're also an onanim. Okay, now on that day, there were supposed to be 3 different goats that were offered as sacrifices. Now it might sound boring, the details might bore you, but the lesson I promise you is going to be very relevant. At least relevant. I find it relevant. I want to qualify that promise. It's relevant to me. And if you choose, it may be relevant to you as well. The first goat was supposed to be Chanukas HaMishkan, meaning to inaugurate the temple, to inaugurate the tabernacle. The second one was the personal donation brought by the Nasi, by the leader of the tribe of Yehuda, Nachshon ben Aminadav. And the third one was a Soyer of Rosh Chodesh. It was Rosh Chodesh Nisan. It was the first day of the month of Nisan, which we're approaching quickly. And that day is because it's Rosh Chodesh, there's a specific offering that had to be brought on Rosh Chodesh in general. In other words, it wasn't just something that was connected to the inauguration of the tabernacle, but rather it was something connected with Rosh Chodesh. And so every Rosh Chodesh they would bring that Soyer of Rosh Chodesh. We read about it in the prayers of Rosh Chodesh. We talk about the Soyer of Rosh Chodesh there. Now, in general, the halacha is that the Kohanim eat from all of the 3 korbanos that are brought. So the Kohanim were supposed to eat, this was the instruction, the Kohanim were supposed to eat from all of the 3 korbanos. On that day, they brought all of the 3 goats as an offering, but they only ate from 2 of them. The third one, meaning the one that's associated with Rosh Chodesh, this is one they didn't touch. They wouldn't eat from it. Now you might ask why. Why did they eat from those first 2 and not the third one? So here's the story. When you're an onen, there are certain halachas that are suspended. So God says to Moshe that inasmuch as Aaron and his sons are onanim, so you might think that they should not participate in eating the chatos. However, because it's the inauguration of the tabernacle, so therefore that law is suspended. That law is suspended, that the onin should not participate. So even though they're onanim, they should just continue as though they were not onanim. All of the service should be performed as though they were not onanim.
Why is that again?
Because it's a special day. It's the first day the tabernacle is being inaugurated. Moshe understood that directive applied to all 3 of the goats. Meaning these are all 3 important sacrifices that are brought on this very special first day of having a temple for God here in this physical world. This is a big deal. So Moshe was of the opinion and understood the directive to apply to all 3 of the goats.
And they're the only Kohanim at this point?
Yeah.
They have to eat all these goats?
They eat from it. They eat from the meat. Yeah. Aaron, however, he understood that there's a difference between the goats, the difference between the sacrifices. The first 2 sacrifices that were being offered as part of the inauguration of the tabernacle, namely the one which is for Chanukas HaMishkan per se, meaning for the inauguration of the actual tabernacle. The second one, which is being offered by Nachshon and Aminadav, who's the leader of the tribe of Yehuda. These 2, inasmuch as they are connected and associated with this special event, so God is saying, because there's a special event going on, so anything associated with a special event should suspend the ordinary law. Moshe didn't read it that way. Moshe thought that even the third one should be eaten from. Even the third goat should also be eaten from by the Kohanim. The Kohanim should also partake of the third goat. Why? Because in Moshe's understanding, God's directive applied throughout. It applied to everything. Even what we would refer to as a korban which is ledoros, meaning something that is there being implemented now for the first time, but is going to repeat itself and every Rosh Chodesh for all future generations. That was Moshe's understanding. And this turned out to become a source of contention between the 2. A very brief source of contention, mind you, but nonetheless, a source of friction, as we'll see in a moment. Let's take a look at text number 1a, 1b, 2a, 2b, etc. Let's take a look. Here's what it says. And Moshe thoroughly investigated concerning the sin offering goat, and behold, it had been burnt, meaning it had been completely consumed by fire and had not been partaken of by the Kohanim. The Kohanim didn't eat any of it. They just allowed the whole thing to burn. So he was angry with Elazar and Isamar, Aaron's surviving sons. So the fact that they had just lost 2 of their brothers wasn't enough. Now Moshe's ire was aroused. This wasn't a good day for them. It wasn't an easy day. So what does he say? Why did you not eat the sin offering in the holy place? For it is holy of holies. It's kachim kachim. And he has given it to you to gain forgiveness for the sin of the community, to effect their atonement before God. Don't forget, the inauguration of the tabernacle indicated that God's presence was still going to be manifest amongst the Jews, despite them having served the golden calf. So he's upset. Moshe is upset. Text 1b. The sin offering goat, the goat of the additional offerings of Rosh Chodesh. And as I mentioned before, the sin offering of Rosh Chodesh is something that is offered every Rosh Chodesh. It's consistent, it's constant, it's there all the time. Every first of the month, there is a Seder Rosh Chodesh. So Moshe thought that even though it's something that's going to be for the future generations as well, meaning it's always going to continue, nonetheless, this very first time, it should follow the same path, it should follow the same parameters as all the other chatois, as all the other goats that were being offered. Let's see what the text has to say over here in Rashi. On that day, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, 3 sin offering goats were sacrificed. Number 1, take a goat for a sin offering. Number 2, the goat of Nachshon, the son of Aminadav, leader of the tribe of Judah. Number 3, the goat of the additional offering of Rosh Chodesh. Good evening. Now all of these, the only one burned was this one, the additional offering of Rosh Chodesh. And why did they burn it? The sages of Israel divided on this matter. So in fact, why they burnt it is in fact the source of disagreement. But we're going to assume the second explanation, but let's just read through the first one as well. Some said that it was burnt on account of the uncleanliness or uncleanness that had come into contact with it, that had come into contact with it, while others said that it was burnt because Aaron's sons were owning him, because this sacrifice came under the category of holy sacrifices that would also be sacrificed in the future generations. Thus they deemed it fit for burning, as the law would require for future generations. So just to explain what he just said, the sons of Aaron and Aaron as well assumed that this third chatos, this third goat, because it was going to be something that would be offered every Rosh Chodesh throughout the future generations, it did not fall under the category, it didn't fall under the rubric of the other goats that they were offering on that day, which were meant to be partaken of. In other words, part of them are supposed to be eaten by the Kohanim. It's a very important part of the process of bringing a korban, is that the Kohen eats part of the korban. So, in their mind, even though God had said that these first two, the initial 2 goats, should be still partaken of even though they're owning him, that whole suspension of the din of owning only applied to the first 2, but not to the third one, because the third one wasn't related to the inauguration of the tabernacle. All it was the beginning of a process that would continue over time for every Rosh Chodesh. So in their minds, the 2 and the third one were completely separate deals. When God said to ignore the law of the onain, that only applied to the first 2, not to the third one.
So Moshe's point though is you're doing this on behalf of all Israel, so you have to do it anyway.
So in his view, God was saying, eat from the third one as well. When God says, even though you're owning, eat from the chatos, it means eat from chatos number 1, eat from chatos number 2, and eat from chatos number 3.
But it's just like that basic. It's not because we're doing it on behalf of all of Israel. It's because God said so. That's it.
Yeah.
That's the rationale.
Because this is what God meant. This was the way Moshe interpreted it. We'll see soon. We'll try to get into the mindset of Moshe to understand why Moshe was saying that. Where was Moshe coming from? What brought him to make that assumption?
Why are we calling it a sin offering? What sin was this from the golden calf, that sin that we're talking about?
It's funny you're asking that question. There are different nuschos, there are different versions of the prayer when it comes to mincha. Mincha is the prayer that we say in the afternoon. So some don't have the custom of reciting supplications after Shemona Esrei, after the Amidah in the afternoon. So I just joke, I kid around, and I say they probably don't have to say the supplications because they didn't sin during the day. Up until that point, nobody's sinned. It's only us, we're the sinners. So I'm kidding around, but I say that tongue in cheek. But at the same time, there was plenty to ask forgiveness of by God for the and every Rosh Chodesh we offer one of these we offer one of these sin offerings. In case somebody did sin inadvertently, there's plenty to bring a carbon for.
But if it was inadvertent, it'd be called a different kind of sin offering.
Possibly, without getting into the details, because it's not in front of me now, so I don't want to comment on that. But that's a good question. We'll take a look at that. But the bottom line is, this is what's required, the chatos. So clearly, it's because of some sin. Okay, let's finish the last part of Rashi. However, when it came to holy sacrifices that were brought only at that time, like the other 2 goat offerings, they relied on Moshe, who had said to them regarding the meal offering, eat it as unleavened loaves, even though they were onanim, assuming that since that meal offering was exclusive to this day, so must Moshe's command apply to all holy sacrifices exclusive to this day. In other words, they had received instructions from Moshe that despite the fact that they were onanim, nonetheless they should still partake of the various sacrifices that were meant to be eaten, and they assumed that also applied to the first 2 of the 3 chatos. But when it came to the third chatos, the third goat, they said, this third goat is not related to the inauguration of the tabernacle. We're just going to assume that it applies to the first 2 and not to the third. And the third, we're going to allow to be completely burned on the altar. So what happens? In text 2a, and Aaron spoke to Moshe. Moshe gets very upset with him. He says, why didn't you eat it? He says, why didn't you eat it? So Vaidaber Aaron spoke to Moshe. He says, but today did they offer up their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord? But if tragic events like these had befallen me, and if I had eaten a sin offering today, would it have pleased God? Rashi says, in text 2b, explains what Aaron said. He wasn't speaking directly. He was kind of speaking in a little bit of a roundabout fashion. So here's what he said: would it have pleased God if you heard this special law, that an onen may eat holy sacrifices brought exclusively for a special occasion? You have no right to be lenient regarding the holy sacrifices offered for future generations, like the sacrifice on Rosh Chodesh. So because there's a third goat being offered today, which is going to be duplicated next Rosh Chodesh and the Rosh Chodesh after it, and the one after that for forevermore. So let's not assume that goat somehow falls under the category of those other goats in which we are permitted to partake of. They're 2 different things. But Moshe was upset. And he was upset at Aaron's sons. Aaron comes to their defense, as we just saw. And so, even though we might think that this is something like an inconsequential disagreement, if we dig a little deeper, we see that there's something very different that between Moshe and Aaron that drives their 2 different perspectives. These 2 different perspectives. One is a perspective of Moshe, the other is a perspective of Aaron. Each has their own perspective, and we'll see what happens in the end.
So Aaron is saying really what? Just in this specific case, that's his opinion, not going forward.
Well, going forward, it wouldn't be relevant because it wouldn't be the inauguration of the tabernacle. In other words, because today is the day of the inauguration of the tabernacle, Aaron is saying that's why God gave you a special instruction that even though we're onanim and we shouldn't be partaking of the korban, but nonetheless partake of it anyway.
But not the third.
Because the third one is not associated with anything to do with, it has nothing to do with integration. Mm-hmm. So that whole suspension of the onin law only applies to the first 2, not to the third. That's Aaron's perspective.
And why was Moshe upset with Aaron?
Because in his opinion, God's instructions applied overall. It applied across the board to all 3. He understood that because the onin law is suspended, it's suspended, period. It's suspended even with regard to the third sacrifice that's got nothing to do with inauguration. You're not an onen right now. Moshe is looking at it from that perspective. You're not an onen. God's saying, as far as we're concerned, you're not an onen right now. Even though you are an onen, for this purpose, you're not an onen. Okay, so let's take a deeper look, somewhat of a mystical look, at the roles of Aaron and the roles of Moshe. And what are they here for? What are they here to do? What do they accomplish? What do they do for the Jewish people? So, the Zohar. We're going to jump from the straightforward interpretation of the Torah, and we're going to go from 0 to 100, and jump right into the Zohar. Normally we try to work our way up through Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod. if you've been listening to the Chassidus Shiurim on the WhatsApp, for those who have WhatsApp, hint, hint, we've been discussing this idea that in the Torah there are 4 layers of interpretation, and we've been then providing a deeper understanding of all 4 based on Chassidus. What does Chassidus bring to the table? And how Chassidus illuminates and enriches all 4 of them without providing anything novel, in the sense that it's not giving us a new interpretation, but just simply enriching and illuminating the interpretation that's already there. So usually we go from Pshat, from the lower level, to the Remez, to the illusion, to the Drush, to the Homiletic, and then ultimately to the mysticism. But here we're going from Pshat straight to the mysticism. So hang on tight. Text number 3. The verse states, and Aaron married Elisheva, the daughter of Aminadav. That's the verse. What does the Zohar say? It makes a comment that seems to be unrelated to the verse. The secret meaning of this verse refers to the community of Israel. Aaron is her shushvina, to put her house in order and to serve her, to escort her to the king, to unify them as one. From here onward, any Kohen that serves in the temple is similar to Aaron. So any Kohen, any priest takes the place of Aaron, and what is Aaron's role? To serve as what's called the shushvina, the escort of the Jewish people. Meaning, Aaron's service was to bring people closer to God, to inspire people, to bring them closer to God, to bring them at whatever level they are, from wherever they are, to bring them a little closer to God. Just like, for example, when a bride and groom get married, so who escorts them to the chuppah, to the wedding canopy? So they have the parents. If, God forbid, parents are not there, so some other married couple will escort them. But the idea is that there has to be somebody who will accompany the bride and the groom. They don't just meet up under the canopy. They don't just drop there. They're brought in. Go ahead.
Is Elisheva, was she the mother of the sons?
Clearly, it seems that's the case. This was Aaron's wife.
Well, we can't tell without help at what point in chronology they're talking about. Because first...
This would need just a little bit more digging, and it would be very easy to find out the answer to this question. But right now I don't have it.
They had second wives or something.
Oh, it's a possibility. That definitely is a possibility. I could take a look at it. I could do some digging.
About the marriage after 2 of the sons died and 2
I don't know that this is necessarily there.
Oh.
I don't know that it's necessarily placed over there. I think we're just learning it there.
Oh.
But this is the Zohar,
Thank you.
so it could be that it's operating with some other, with some other order, and it isn't necessarily out of the chronology that we're familiar with. We have to figure out if this is in fact the case. If Elisheva was their mother or was the second, I don't know. I'd have to look into it. Okay, so what is the Zohar telling us here? It's telling us about the role that Aaron had in terms of his being a spiritual leader of the people. What was his role? His role was to bring people closer, and the posture or the movement was an upwards movement. In other words, his idea was to bring the Jews to God, and as we'll see in a moment, Moshe's role was to bring godliness to the people. 2 very different postures, 2 very different movements, 2 very different roles.
So one brings God up and one brings God down, basically.
Hang in there. Text number 4. You have text number 4, page 271. There were 70 great Sanhedrins, and Moshe presides over them. This is text number 4, again from the Zohar, but from a different section of the Zohar. There were 70 lesser Sanhedrins, and Aaron presides over them. Because of this, the rabbis of the Mishnah said, Moshe is the shushvina of the king. Shushvina is the escort of the king, which is Tiferes, which is one of the divine attributes, called the Great Sanhedrin. Aaron, in other words, it's an allusion to the Great Sanhedrin. Aaron is the shushvina of the queen, which is Malchus, the letter Hey, which is called small, and therefore it is called the Lesser Sanhedrin. Now, why it's small, and why it's Malchus, and why it's letter Hey, this all requires a Kabbalistic investigation and study. But what the Zohar is telling us here is that they have different roles. Aaron has one role, Moshe has another role. Why did they have opposing roles? What was the difference between the two? What were they bringing to the table? In text number 5, this is from Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Baal Tanya. Here's what he says. The two elements of the Sinai desert and the sanctuary are influenced by Moshe and Aaron, since Moshe is the Shushvina of the king. Just as the Shushvina escorts the groom to the place of the bride, so does Moshe draw down God's unity so that it may rest upon and become manifest in the soul of man, which is the element of sanctuary. By the way, I just want to point out, I'm thinking about it, and I'm convinced that there's something to it. By a traditional Orthodox wedding, so there are 2 points at which they take, where they escort the groom and the bride. First, they escort the groom to the bride, and then they take the groom to the wedding canopy, and then they escort the bride to the groom. 2 different, kind of 2 different stages of this process. They take the groom to the bride, and then take the bride to the groom. I'm positive, I haven't looked into it, but with my rabbinic license, I'm going to go off on a limb. I'm going to go on a limb and suggest that there's definitely something to this that is related to our discussion here. I'll take a look, God willing, when I get home. But here's the idea. There is an extension of Moshe in each generation. You see that? In the middle of the first paragraph. And there is an extension of Moshe in each generation, since Moshe is one of the 7 shepherds representing the function of knowing God, who enlivens all life, and there is none else aside from him. Das is not merely knowing. Let's just make sure we're clear. What Moshe's service is, what Moshe does, is he brings people to a greater state of awareness and understanding and cognizance and a intellectual appreciation for God. In the sense of das. Das is knowledge. And when we speak of das in the mystical works, and it actually is this interpretation of das originates in a pasuk of the Torah. What happens? We are told, "V'ha'adam yada as Chava." Adam knew Chava. Adam knew Chava, and she has the child. Which means that the Torah refers to intercourse with the term das. Das meaning knowing. What is the idea of knowledge? Knowledge means an intimate awareness of something. So Moshe's purpose, Moshe's function, is to bring a very deep, very clear understanding and awareness of godliness to the people in a form of das. Das where it's right here in front of you. It's so obvious. That's the function of Moshe. He brings das to the table. God becomes something that is incontrovertible. It's empirical. There's nothing that it's not elusive anymore. It's right there in front of you. That's Moshe's function. Das is not merely knowing, it actually means feeling, a feeling in the heart that one recognizes and feels as if he sees clearly with his eyes. As it is stated, see now that I am him, there is no God aside from me. Although this verse speaks of the Messianic era, nevertheless, this ability exists in each and every Jewish soul on account of the sustenance it receives from the soul of Moshe, namely to firmly bind his thoughts to God in the same manner that one is bound to a visible scene that is witnessed. But to be bound to God requires great effort. So it's possible for every Jewish soul during this era to become close to God as we would be, or as we will be, God willing, very soon, in the time of the Messianic era, when godliness is something that becomes very obvious and is out there like for example, the Medrash says that it won't be necessary for us to study the law that we can't pick fruit from a tree on Shabbos, because the tree itself will shout out, it's Shabbos today. Now, to a young child, it sounds like there's going to be like this speaker that's going to emerge from inside the bark of the tree, and is going to, there's going to be a special electronic mechanism in there that's going to yell at you if it sees you approaching. Shabbos, Shabbos, Shabbos. No, it's not the way it's going to work. Because we become aware of something, of a reality that today we are not aware of. So we are using the metaphor of the tree calling out that today's Shabbos. It doesn't mean that the tree necessarily is going to speak. It simply means we're going to become aware that today is Shabbos, and it's as if the tree itself is calling out to us that today is Shabbos.
A couple mushrooms later, that tree can speak.
So Aaron is the Shemini of the king. So that's the queen. So this is what Moshe's function is. Moshe's function is to bring us to a state of awareness of godliness as if the tree itself is talking. As if the tree itself is calling out, it's Shabbos today. Aaron is the Shemini of the queen, which refers to the souls of the Jewish people. Aaron is the one who raises these souls to become bound with God, the source of life. For Aaron is one of the 7 shepherds drawing down the ability of our souls, for our souls, to become aroused, meaning inspired, which is the level of thirst and flames of passionate fire. Aaron's role is to lift up the flames, which are the souls of the Jewish people, for the candle of God is the soul of man. Aaron caused the flames to be kindled and to become a raging flame. The function of Aaron is different than the function of Moshe. Moshe draws godliness to the people. He presents them with a reality. Here, this is the reality. You see it? It's in front of you. Now, do what you want. I'm showing you what the reality is. He's less about inspiring the people than bringing the knowledge and the awareness to the people. Aaron's function is a little bit different. Aaron raises their spirits. He inspires them. He lights the fire within them. He kindles the fire within them. It's a different function. So Aaron sees the Jewish people from one perspective. Moshe sees the Jewish people from a different perspective. Moshe is seeing the Jewish people from a perspective of absolute truth, meaning the absolute truth of God. Aaron sees them from the perspective that the Jewish people themselves see God. And because of the differences, we're going to see soon how these differences led Moshe and Aaron to interpret God's instruction differently. Hillel tells us in text number 6, this is from the Ethics of the Fathers. Hillel says, "Be among the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving the creations and drawing them near to the Torah." Aaron was about peace, more about peace than he was about truth. Sometimes for peace, we need to cover up the truth a little bit. Has anybody over here ever tried to do what's called redning a shidduch, which means propose a match for somebody? You tried to propose a match for somebody? Did you tell them the absolute 100% truth about the individual you were proposing? Did you tell them that they lost, or they've gone out X number of times, or they have this personality defect, or their family is not so Have you ever tried to read a shidduch? You're obviously going to steer clear of anything that's going to...
Great personality.
Great personality.
Lost a lot of weight.
Great.
Lost a lot of weight. He's doing great now. Now they're really heading upwards. They're really
Out of rehab.
out of rehab. Okay.
Almost
That's
a
the
month.
extreme. But just, modestly. You're always going to try to smooth over the bumps. Any defects that they might have are going to be, less important to report. And if they ask about it, there was such a thing, but you know what? But it's already taken care of. It's not such an issue. No, they're not so short. No, they're not so tall. No, they're not so
Acquitted.
So that's the way it works. When you're trying to bring peace between husband and wife, when you're trying to bring peace between man and his fellow, when you're trying to bring peace between peoples, between groups of people, between political parties, between different parties, warring parties, warring countries, you're always going to try to find a middle ground where each of them could find a common denominator and forget about their differences and just focus on what brings them together. So there's going to be some fudging the facts to a degree. You want to bring peace together, peace to people, emes is going to have to be buried. That's why it says, emes me'eretz titzmach. Emes is going to grow from the ground. Because when God created the world, he had to take the emes, he had to take the truth, and throw it into the ground. Throw it into the ground. Why do you have to throw it into the ground? Because with emes, you can't create the world. If you're going to have absolute emes in the world, you're not going to have much of a world. You're not going to be able to have a functioning, operating world with emes being front and center. Emes is going to have to suffer some type of compromise. You're not going to be able to have full emes.
It's kind of hard to swallow, isn't it?
Full emes you can have. It's not going to happen.
Just our understanding of what full MS means. It's just an algorithm that we don't have all the variables to. We don't understand all of it.
Well, we don't
It's gotta
understand
be
all of
MS,
it
we
because
just don't understand it.
because God is the
way
ultimate
we
truth.
understand MS.
Yeah, correct.
But it's
So-
got to be the ultimate parsimony. It's got to be the ultimate MS. Or what are we doing being lied to?
So maybe we don't know.
Very hard to swallow.
Huh?
Because we don't really know.
No, but it's
We are not aware of the full truth of reality.
No, but-
In order for the world to exist as a concealment, meaning as
But
a
and it is good, right?
We think
It's
we
got to
know,
be
but we
good.
don't.
We just don't understand in our way. We think we understand what good means. We're told that we simply don't have the full algorithm. We don't have all the variables by which to understand this good. Like, can God beat you in chess in one move? Absolutely, it's God. It's just not called chess anymore because the way we understand chess, you cannot win in one move. Yes, God can absolutely beat you in chess in one move, just not under our definition of chess, not under our arbitrary definition of MS.
okay, not to go off on a tangent,
I live there.
but not to go off too much on a tangent. I would say that although I agree with what you're saying, but because God, we speak of God as a kol yachol, meaning that He's capable of everything. So we do accept the notion that because God is beyond any definition, so therefore He can beat us at chess in one move,
Absolutely.
and it will also be our version of chess. Now that truth is not something we're capable of absorbing.
I would much rather hear that than we can't handle the truth.
no, but
We can't handle that truth. That truth, we're as created beings, we have a very difficult time absorbing.
It's much easier to swallow. We don't understand through the keyhole that we see things. We can't understand that MS. I'd much rather that than God had to take the MS and kind of bury it into the ground the way you get your fat cousin to go out on a date. That's very hard to swallow.
yeah, but Elokeinu is emet versus the four-letter word is kindness, and if we can't live if we were judged by Elokeinu, and Elokeinu was the one who created the world.
So therefore, finish the question.
So that's why you needed Aaron, because he brings kindness, representing the four-letter word.
Four-letter name, you mean?
And Moshe represents the Elokeinu, which is the king, quote unquote.
Let's take a look at the next text where he deals somewhat with that question, with the names a little bit with the names over there. About chesed and emes, he doesn't use the same terms that you're using, but there's clearly an important meeting point between the two that is necessary. So let's take a look. Text number 7. And God said to Aaron, "Go greet Moshe in the desert." This is when Moshe is on his way back to Egypt. And God tells Moshe, go and greet Aaron, because Aaron is on his way back, on his way out to see you. Go greet Moshe in the desert. And he went and encountered him at the mountain of God, Mount Sinai, and he went and he kissed him. So on this verse, and he went and he kissed him, says the Medrash. This is the meaning of the verse. In Tehillim, kindness and truth encounter one another. Justice and peace kiss. This is the verse in Tehillim in the Psalms. What does this all mean? This is a reference to this encounter between Moshe and Aaron. Kindness refers to Aaron, as it is stated, and to Levi he said, your Urim and Tumim to a man of peace. In other words, that verse implies, that the function of Aaron, who was from the Shevet of Levi, he was the priest, he's the man of peace, and he's the one who wore the Urim and Tumim, the special breastplate that through which God would communicate. Truth refers to Moshe, as it states, not so Moshe my servant, he is faithful throughout my house. So in other words, Moshe is faithful. Moshe is about truth. Moshe is about unbending truth. Thus kindness and peace encounter each other, as it says, and he went and encountered him at the mountain of God. Justice is Moshe, as it states, the justice of God he has done. Peace is Aaron, as it states, in peace and in equity he went with me, and the two kiss, meaning the two encounter. Now, Moshe appreciated the absolute truth of God. He wasn't prepared to compromise on the truth. But when it came to bringing peace between people, that had to be brought about by Aaron. It was Aaron's attribute of peace, of loving peace, and the ability to generate that type of conversation that brought about peace between each other. And in fact, when Moshe passes on, we find that the Jews mourn him for less time than they mourn Aaron. More people mourn Aaron, and for more time than they do mourn Moshe. Why? Because Moshe was strict, he was truth, he was absolute. This is the way it is, that's it. Aaron brought peace between husband and wife, between families, between feuding partners and parties. And Aaron, therefore, brought so much. I don't want to say so much more, but it is so much more in terms of relationships to the table.
It was a necessary fight because at that time, people were, I would imagine, really into making gods out of anything and anybody. So if Moshe seemed as though he was the all and end all, every attribute, it would be really easy to make a god out of him. He was the one who brought us the Torah, and he's this mix of every attribute. We would blur the lines. We would worship him. This kind of shows that one man cannot have every attribute. He doesn't have that aspect. Aaron complimented him. A god doesn't need a compliment. They are their own complement. So this kind of separated that.
Saying the fact that Moshe wasn't gifted with both attributes, that itself was important for the Jewish people to see, to have to know.
Because then you could definitely skew fact. He was the one that brought us the Torah. He was the one that spoke to us. That set us in line. That's partially the reason we don't know exactly where he lies, lest we make that into
it would be an international shrine
kind of place to
of
worship
epic proportions.
Moshe. But this shows even more so. He was not all things to everybody. He was immortal. Case in point.
Okay, I wasn't going to use the term mortal to be able to. I was just going to say Moshe appreciated a reality that wasn't and is not the reality that we see. He appreciated godliness, and his job and his role was to bring that reality to the people and place it before them. This is the way it is. But he wasn't about couching it in terms that, or inspiring the people to embrace it. He was simply providing it in front.
He couldn't beat you in chess in one move. He couldn't do it. Only God could.
Yeah, but I don't know that was the necessary. That was the. In other words, I don't see anybody here. In other words, I'm afraid to read into the text and say that that's the reason why God didn't make him with both attributes, so that we shouldn't worship him. Because at the end of the day, there are some tremendous things that are said about Moshe Rabbeinu that would border on that, if not for the fact that we know God is not a human being. It says, "Vayaminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdo." They believed in Moshe, in God, and they believed in Moshe. That says that. We say that in our prayers every day.
Moshe,
And the
Moshe,
Mechilta actually
right?
says this, that if one denies Moshe, one is denying the one who appointed Moshe. In other words, one denies God.
Well, it's dangerous territory.
So this is heavy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I'm not going to the point of saying that this is the reason why he wasn't gifted with
Just
both
the-
attributes. This is what God wanted. In other words, this was a relationship. There's a relationship. Moshe is the escort of God. Aaron is the escort of the people, and each one has their role to play.
Just a mindset that came out a couple thousand, not even a couple thousand years. No, after this, a couple thousand years made just that a God out of a person who could communicate with all people on all levels. That's exactly what had happened a couple thousand or so years after this. In order not to do that, this as a necessary argument, maybe.
Perhaps.
Yeah. So they both had a balance. So it was like not like good cop, bad cop. It was like good cop and kind cop.
Okay, so this is already, what was God's rationale for making it that way? But the fact is, this is the way it was. They had two different roles to play, and now we could perhaps understand why they went different directions when it came to understanding what God wanted here. One saw things from an absolute perspective. God said, today we're suspending the law of Onan, period. Moshe says the law of Onan is suspended. Today you're not an Onan, finished. So you're going to eat from all the three chatois, all the three goats that are being offered. Aaron says, wait a second. That's not the way we interpret things. That's not the way I interpreted things. He says, from my perspective, I see the differences, I see the nuances between people, between places, between things, between events. This isn't just one size fits all. The first two you're right about. The third one, that's got nothing to do with the inauguration. So in that case, the law doesn't apply. What happens? Moshe ultimately agrees with Aaron. Moshe actually agrees with Aaron. He says, Vayitav Adover, whereas we said, we're going to see it in a moment. But let's first take a look at text number 8. From Moshe's perspective, whenever there is uncertainty, we choose to make no differentiation between one situation and another. In this specific instance, Moshe chose not to make a differentiation between the sacrifices of the day and the sacrifices that would last for all generations. The holiness that is felt at this moment must remain for all generations. Moshe was saying that the holiness that's felt at this day of inauguration should be something that's felt throughout all generations. I don't know. I'm not informed any other way. This is probably what God means, and therefore I'm not drawing any distinctions. God probably wants the holiness of the day of the inauguration to be something that will be ever present in the offering of the Rosh Chodesh goat. So Rosh Chodesh offering. So Aaron was different. Aaron reflected the kind view. Aaron was one who loved all creation and drew them close to Torah. He was dedicated to all Jews, even those who are on the level of creatures, no matter their status in life. Thus, from Aaron's perspective, he could see the distinction between the holiness of the moment and the holiness that would remain for generations. It is too much to demand that these people maintain a constant aura of great holiness throughout the vicissitudes of time. For Moshe, the Shemini of the king, whose role was to draw down godliness from above to below, he transmitted the godly light in a manner that preserved it whole, without any degradation. This was the path that Moshe took when dealing with bestowing godly energy upon the Jewish nation. That was his approach. This was the approach he always took. But for Aaron, the Shemini of the queen, meaning the escort of the queen, meaning of the Jewish people, whose role was to elevate the Jewish people from below to above, this elevation was dependent upon the state of the Jewish people. Accordingly, he understood that the service would also be subject to differences congruent to the fluctuation that exists in the human experience. Because he appreciated the differences in human experience, so therefore he understood God's instruction to apply as well to apply according to those parameters.
There's so much here, actually, that if I'm over speaking, just please shut me up. But in practice, it comes up often that how are we going to measure how we're doing, the progress that we're making or not making. Are we going to measure our progress based on how far we get from where we don't want to be, or how close we get, how much closer we get to where we want to get to? And at some point, you have to make that paradigm shift. Because if we keep progressing forward, measuring forward progressive motion against where we don't want to be, we keep on reinforcing where we don't want to be. We keep reifying it, making a thing out of it, pointing it out, underlying. At some point, we have to stop talking about it. So with Moshe, he was the one, he had to be built like he was built to be able to take them out of Egypt, from where they don't want to be, from a dangerous place. Where Aaron had to be the non-Moshe to take them in. It couldn't be Moshe. They couldn't look at him and remind themselves of where they came from, that this is Moshe. In order to take them out, he had to be okay with so many people staying in Egypt.
I find this as a very profound thought.
So many
I think
people
it's a very profound insight.
staying in Egypt. So many people dying on the way. Where Aaron's the kind of general where no man is left in the field no matter what. But then the attack can't progress. But Moshe had to be this kind of cold, leave the bodies there. Keep walking. And Aaron
Keep your eyes on the go.
Keep walking. They left so many in Egypt. They left so many bodies in along that whole 40 years. That once they got there, it could no longer be Moshe. Aaron leaves no one in the...
There's no one behind.
Right.
That's a great insight. That's a
be
great
Moshe
insight. I
anymore.
appreciate it. Thank you. So that's the idea. Okay, so what happens? What's the verdict? So even though originally Moshe is upset, ultimately when he hears Aaron's rationale, so in text number 9a, Vayishma Moshe vayitav b'geinov, and Moshe heard, and it was good in his eyes. It's good in his eyes. In text 9b, it was good in his eyes. He admitted and was not ashamed to say, I did not hear, meaning I did not hear this quote directly from God. God didn't tell me that I have to be so exacting when it comes to enforcing this law, that I should apply it, across the board. So you might ask me, so which one is it in terms of our own service of God? Are we supposed to be like Moshe, or are we supposed to be like Aaron? So
neither were supposed to be like ourselves.
I think we need to have both. We need to, at one point, we need to be looking towards where we came from, right? And how far are we getting away from where we came from? And then at the same time, we also have to have a different perspective where we have our eye on the truth, the absolute truth. So in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe talks about different levels of truth, which I believe responds to degree to what we were talking about before. There's Svas Emes. In Torah, we find different terms applying to truth. Svas Emes means a language of truth, or lips of truth, meaning it's kind of external, but there's some truth to it. It's truth on a certain level. Then you have Emes, truth, and then you have Emes la'amitoy, ultimate truth, the absolute ultimate truth. Different layers of truth. So when it comes to
sons, right? 4 sons. They're all answered in their own way. Not a single one of them is lied to, but they're all answered in their own way.
Correct. I'm not sure though that you're giving any of the one sons the emes la'amitoy, the ultimate absolute truth.
I don't know if that applies here.
But the point being that there are different levels of truth when it comes to a person's service of God. Meaning, when a person, for example, let's talk about in the paradigm that Alter Rebbe talks about in the Tanya, a person stands up and begins to engage in davening, and in the process of the prayer, they begin to feel close to God. What happens when they're done davening? They go and they meet somebody, and they forget that they davened, and they forget that they felt close to God, and they do something that they shouldn't have done. They make a choice they make a decision, they make a choice that God wouldn't have wanted them to do, and if they were in the same state as they were during the davening, if that state had remained with them, they wouldn't have made the choice that they made. So would we say that their service of God is false? Do we say that what they experience during prayer is false? Are they just living in a false reality? They're just not. They're a false servant of God. They're not really serving God. It's only the one who has complete, absolute, ultimate truth in his life. He's the one who serves God. So the Alter Rebbe tells us that there are different levels of truth. And even though the intermediary level of a person, which is a Beinoni, which is something we all need to strive for, to be a Beinoni, and why, to answer that question, we need to learn Tanya. But we're all striving to be Beinoni, people who are in the intermediary category. So we all have to appreciate the moments of truth in our lives and not be discouraged by the fact that after we're done with that moment of truth, that inspiration, that sense of devotion or attachment to God withdraws, and we become acclimated to a different environment, and then we go back to davening, we're back to our original state. We shouldn't be discouraged by that. In text number 10, by virtue of the preponderance of the divine soul, the Beinoni is able to reach a state of love during prayer. However, in comparison with the degree of love reached by tzaddikim, who serve God in perfect truth, the Beinoni's love is not called true service at all, since it passes and disappears after prayer. Something really true will live up to the words of the verse, the lip of truth shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Nevertheless, in relation to the rank of the intermediate people, his love is regarded as a truly perfect service in terms of their level of truth. Every Beinoni, according to their level. And yes, in this case too, the Beinoni's love during prayer may be termed as the lip of truth shall be established forever, since their divine soul has the power to reawaken this kind of love constantly during its preponderance in time of prayer, day after day, by means of an appropriate mental preparation, each soul according to its intrinsic quality and rank. Truth is the attribute of Yaakov, who is called the middle bolt that secures everything from end to end, from the highest gradations and degrees to the end of all grades. And in each gradation and plane it fixes its bolt through the most central point, which is the point and quality of its attribute of truth. So there's emes for the tzaddik, there's emes for the righteous, and there's emes for the Beinoni, for the one who's in the intermediary level. And truth, it's true also. In other words, for the Beinoni, it's also true. While he's davening, or while she's davening, every person could achieve that level, that state of dveikus, attachment to God, and the feelings that generates is real. It's not fake. It's not false. We shouldn't think it's false. There's a kernel of truth there, and that kernel of truth can be reawakened at a later point when they return back to davening, or learning, or studying, or doing good mitzvahs, whatever it might be. So that doesn't upend, that doesn't undo its truthfulness. And so ultimately, Moshe came to recognize that even though, from my perspective, I focus on the absolute truth, I focus on what's, the total absolute reality of God, but the truth of the matter is, because God created and wants and sustains the reality of humanity, the reality of the universe, from their perspective, there's a whole nother perspective of truth. It's a whole nother attitude. So Moshe hears Aaron protesting, and he says, you know something? Vayitav adavar beinav. He says, you know something? You're right. It's a good point. It's a good point. I was focused on my way of thinking, but now that I hear your perspective, so I always hear by Sheva Brachas, and when they talk about Sheva, when after a couple gets married, so they hold a Sheva Brachas for 7 days. They have this party, this religious thing. They party for 7 days after a marriage. So different speakers at different Sheva Brachas have mentioned this idea that when Moshe listened, he said, "Hey, you know what? That's a good idea." So when your wife talks to you, it pays to pay attention, listen, and if you listen, it might actually sound good. It might actually be a good piece of advice, but you have to listen. Vayishma Moshe heard, Vayita be'einav, and it's not a bad idea. Not a bad idea. It's a good idea. So sometimes we have to pay attention. Without paying attention, we're not going to see the truth. Okay, with that we'll close. We'll leave the other texts for another time, and wish each other a great night and life of truth.
Can I just ask you